So use this mic. So my name's Helen Connolly, and I'm just going to chat to you this afternoon about a few things that might be important over the coming weeks and months. So we all have a moral code, which is really just a set of rules and guidelines that dictate how we think, how we act, and how we treat other people. And then within each of our disciplines, we are guided by the values of our profession. And so for myself as a doctor, and for all of you as doctors, that's outlined in the GMC and what makes us a good doctor. Okay, so it's about making the care of your patient your first priority, being competent, protecting safety, acting in an open and honest way, and always with integrity. And we feel that these are the foundations and that they are secure and they are what make us a good doctor. And then something completely unexpected and extraordinary happens, and it's almost as if there's a tectonic shift in the ground below us. And it may be leading some people to question how stable those foundations actually are. Now, Claire Marks, who's the chair of the GMC, assures us that the tenets of being a good doctor will remain the same throughout this crisis. But even she acknowledges that some may be pushed to their limits and beyond. So I think as healthcare workers, we've always taken great pride in the fact that the NHS provides the sickest patients with the greatest chance of recovery. But some may feel that over the coming weeks and months that they're going to be asked to make choices that were previously unimaginable. And people fear that it will no longer be a case of we did all that we could, but rather a case of we did our best with the staff and the resources that we had, but it wasn't enough. So faced with these pressures, never has it been more important than now than to think about how we're going to manage this stress. And the paradox is that when things are at their most pressured, it becomes even more important to turning our attention to managing our well-being. And stress obviously is a natural and important thing, and it's because our brain's main function is to try and keep us safe. And we all function well with a moderate level of stress. It's what gets us through exams, it's what gets us through everyday life as a doctor, and we remain in control with that. However, if stress is relentless and continuous, the high levels of cortisol can just wreak havoc on your brain and wreak havoc on your ability to be able to control your stress. And you can enter this vicious cycle when you can have physical symptoms, emotional symptoms, and behavioural changes. And in the long term, if we don't address our stress, there's the potential to set the stage for longer term mental health difficulties. So we need to be alert to the signs of stress in ourselves and in other people and in our colleagues. Often the first sign is that of physiological hyperarousal. Our bodies are better at being able to tell us that we need to take a breath or a break long before we actually identify it within ourselves. So if you notice physical changes, if you notice yourself feeling muscle tension, short of breath, heart racing, fitful sleep, it may be that your stress levels are creeping up. You become emotionally different, you're more irritable, you may be dread coming in, you're finding it difficult to switch your brain off. Your behaviours might change, you might avoid things, you might avoid coming into situations, you might find it hard to make decisions, you might start overeating, over-drinking. All of these are changes that can happen whenever we're feeling more stressed. And then, once all our resources are consumed, we can't actually withstand anything else, and we've hit burnout. So you'll probably all be familiar with the stress performance curve, but it just depicts really clearly why we need to manage stress. At this time, we need to be performing optimally if we can, and in order to do that, we need to be maintaining our stress levels at what is an appropriate level. And I actually don't like the terminology stress and burnout, because I think it's a wee bit victim shaming. I think it's a wee bit about saying you're not resilient enough, you're not strong enough, you're not resourceful enough, it's your fault, you've burnt yourself out. And really all it is that people's buckets have become overflowing. We all carry around buckets that are filled by whatever our responsibilities are. And as healthcare workers, we're kind of serving three masters. Our patients, ourselves and our family, and our employer. And normally, water flows into our buckets from all those different areas in our life, and we're able to, at times, offload some areas when other areas are pouring in more. But at the minute, the water's pouring in all aspects of our lives. We're socially distancing from our families. We're being asked to do things at work that we were never asked to do before. So that's why the potential for us becoming completely overwhelmed is so great. And we're hearing a lot at the minute about people being in the front line and this being a war and so on. So if we look at how the military has responded to unprecedented events, okay, there's a terminology called moral injury, which is really a term that's given to psychological distress that results from actions or the lack of them which violate someone's moral or ethical code. And at the minute, we need to be mindful of the fact that over coming months there may be seeds of moral injury planted in people. And how that manifests itself often is people can internalise it on themselves. They can have intrusive negative thoughts about themselves, feelings of shame and guilt and blame. Or they can externalise it. They can be angry or hostile or distrusting towards other people. Or they can just cognitively disassociate from it altogether. Now, not everyone that experiences a potentially morally injurious event is going to be injured psychologically from it, okay? Same way that people that have high blood pressure, not everyone gets a stroke, but we have to be aware of the potential and the vulnerability of that to happen. And recently, actually, JAMA published a cross-sectional survey looking at the mental health outcomes of 1,300 healthcare workers in China. And what they noted was that large numbers of them experienced some level of psychological distress, up to 70% experienced some level of psychological distress. And the British Journal of Psychiatry in 2018, they published a meta-analysis, again looking at the impact of potentially morally injurious events on people's mental health. And they noted that it accounted for a 9% variance in PTSD, 5% variance in depression, and a 2% variance in suicide. So although small, clearly significant. And obviously, understandably, we may try to ignore the traumas, create distance between ourselves and the experience. Distance from the emotion, a bit like people say pulling your hand away from a gas stove or a lit flame. It's an impulse to get away from the source of the pain. But unfortunately, sometimes once a trauma has been experienced or witnessed, it can't be ignored or it can't be denied. And in actual fact, reflecting on the fact that there's this potential and considering how you're going to manage it can impact on whether a psychological trauma injures you or not. And in actual fact, if we consider it correctly, there's the possibility when trauma exists to actually experience psychological growth. So you can, at the end of it, feel an increased sense of self-esteem, a greater appreciation of the value of life. It doesn't mean that you're necessarily going to be injured. And I think that core to this is us really acknowledging the full range of emotions that exist. I think as healthcare workers we're not great at doing that. I don't know why that is. I think we kind of have this bias that we have to know all the answers, that we can't admit whenever we don't, or when we're struggling. But I think we really have to challenge that stigma in ourselves and in others. We have to get to a stage when our experiences of fear and distrust and uncertainty are as valid as our experiences of happiness and pride and so on. And we have to really appreciate that this is a marathon and it's not a sprint. And if we exhaust ourselves in the first mile, and anybody that's run a marathon will appreciate this, if you exhaust yourself in the first mile, it makes all the rest of the miles so much more difficult. So we have to make maintaining our mental well-being important in the long run. Okay. So Please, this is just a wee simple acronym. It's kind of to act as an aid memoir as to what we need to do to build our resilience. So it involves ordinary processes, very straightforward things, but there has to be a willingness to give them a go, like going to the gym for your brain. And at times of stress, we need to be reminded to do these things. So P just stands for physical. Remember to exercise. And exercise outside if possible, and as often as you possibly can. It's so important for managing anxiety. L is just for remembering to look after underlying health conditions. And that might sound very straightforward, and you might think, how would you forget? But I myself take regular medication, and at the minute, over the last number of weeks, I have found that I have forgotten to take it. E stands for eating healthily, regularly, looking after those basic needs. A means just avoid things that are bad for us, poor coping mechanisms. Avoid excess food. Easier said than done. Avoid excess alcohol, avoid too much media, and use the available resources that make you feel better at other times of stress. So watching a box set or reading a book or whatever it is for you. S is for sleep. Sleep, sleep, sleep. I cannot emphasise this enough. It is one of the most important things for protecting your mental health. And I think at times like this, it's easy to think of sleep as a luxury, but it's not. It's an essential, not only for your mental health, but to protect you physically in the long run as well. And then finally, E is for engaging. So engaging in things that are enjoyable to you. So it's very, very difficult for your brain to be anxious and curious at the same time. And engaging with people. At this time of social distancing, it's never been more important to focus on human connections than it is right now. Friends, families, peers, managers. Our risk of psychological injury is mitigated a lot by the human connections we make at times of stress. We need to look after each other, we need to be compassionate, and we need to acknowledge the experience of working through this crisis. So despite all this resilience building that we're all going to be doing, and we're going to be so resilient, there are still going to be times when you're going to become overwhelmed. Times when you may feel acutely anxious in a particular situation. And again, this is just a very simple wee technique that I would encourage you to use. It's well known in the world of mindfulness. And it's if you're feeling overwhelmed, to just stop. Stand back, take a break, and acknowledge it's okay to pause. Take a breath, concentrate on your breathing, and let your breathing and your breath just ground you back into the moment. Then observe, using your 5 senses, what's going on at that particular time. What can you hear? What can you see? Can't remember your senses. What can you taste? What can you smell? And again, that just grounds you back into the moment. And then, after you've done that, proceed with greater clarity. Or if you can't, step away from the situation. So much of what everybody's experiencing now is anticipatory anxiety. Fear for what the future is going to hold. Okay? And then often when the future comes, in actual fact, the reality and how we're able to cope with it is much better than we anticipate. But our thoughts can become overwhelming and they can become negative. And this is really psychiatry's answer to catch it, bin it, kill it. This is a way of trying to boundary your negative thoughts. Okay? And really all it means is thinking about, is what I'm thinking right now useful to me in this moment? Okay? So you catch it by identifying that you're having a potentially unhelpful thought. Okay? Just try and challenge it as best you can. And then, if you can, you change it. Or if you can't change it, you just discard it and say to yourself, it's only a thought. It's not a reflection of the reality of what's going on. Okay, so I've talked a little bit about what we can do. I think we also need to talk about maybe what the trust or what our employers need to do in order to support us in managing our well-being. So you may be familiar with this Maslow's pyramid, hierarchy of needs, okay? But it depicts really, really well that there are some utterly non-negotiable basic needs that need to be met. Food, water, warmth, rest. These have to be met before attention can be turned to anything else. So priorities in the trust must be arranged around that. And once that base is met, then the supports are there to build in the other aspects that we need. So we probably all remember the Chilean mining disaster, which was in 2010, believe it or not. And at that stage, 33 miners got trapped in a caved-in mine below the ground. So the problem seemed totally insurmountable. People were overwhelmed. People were psychologically distressed. The miners, some of them felt suicidal. It really did feel like a hopeless situation. And then they managed to get a drill hole through to the miners. And what they did, first and foremost, was to meet the miners' basic needs. Send them food, send them water, send them medication. And that brought them a sense of security. And that put that base in place. And then they began to communicate with the miners on a regular basis. And then after that, they began the preparation and the teamwork and the leadership around how they were going to get those miners out. And they did, and what seemed like a completely unachievable task, they managed to save all of the miners. Okay? So I think organisations or the trust can learn from that and say, we need to understand the need to meet the basic needs. We need to communicate really clearly with people. We need to have clear plans and preparation. We need to have good, strong leadership, and we need to have support at every step of the way. And in Wuhan, they realised that really quite quickly, and they changed their psychological protection plan around that. So they were getting feedback from people that their concerns were about safety or fear, not so much from themselves, but for their families and so on, and fear around their competencies, not only within their workplace, but also their ability to manage the anxiety of patients that they were looking after. There obviously was difficulties with patients complying with the quarantine and complying with the interventions, be that through anxiety or misunderstanding. And this obviously proved really challenging for healthcare professionals. So what they did was, they just established ensuring that all healthcare workers were guaranteed food, daily living supplies, spaces to rest, leisure activities. They even went to the stage of videoing the healthcare workers' daily routines and sending those home to family members to reassure them that everything was going okay. And then obviously detailed plans around safety and PPE and all of those kinds of things. And then they established training for the healthcare workers in managing their own anxiety and the anxiety of their patients. And then finally, there was an aspect of listening ear, which is kind of an informal kind of thing that they established for psychological support. So it's good to know that already in the Trust we're ahead of that. I understand there's been wobble rooms established within A&E, and there's going to be breakout rooms, I think, in other parts of Altnagelvin. And I think, these are just areas where you can go and you can rest and you can communicate, and you can feel safe. But I think it's really important that as the surge goes on, that there's continued emphasis from managers on the importance of regular rest, and this needs to be modelled and supported by them as much as possible. So just to touch briefly on the preparedness or the preparation. So again, during the SARS crisis, it seems that if people perceived that they were well prepared, it was psychologically protective to them. And again, that makes sense. If you think about a paramedic going out to a road traffic accident, they feel competent and they feel psychologically prepared for that, whereas a general member of the public may not do. So you can see that one would be more at risk of psychological injury than the other. And obviously we have our personal responsibility that we talked about, and the Trust there also has a responsibility to enhance training and develop competencies as much as they can, what they're striving to do with all of this before the surge. But as it continues, it's going to be really important that there's ongoing clarity as much as possible about roles, responsibilities, expectations. People having some sense of autonomy over their own workplace is really important in terms of psychological protection. And rotation from areas of higher stress to areas of lower stress. Obviously that seems to be important in terms of a physical health protective role, but it's also really important from a mental health protective role as well. And then it's really important that managers at all levels, everybody, is visible and is communicating in open, frank and truthful ways, because people's anxiety levels will only increase if they do not feel the communication is completely transparent. And again, just touching again on the human connection side of things. Having other people, so peers, who match our experience is grounding and helps us to make sense of what is happening, which is vital for long-term psychological and emotional processing. So peer support is really important. Some people are looking at buddying systems, pairing up more experienced with less experienced. Again, not only is that supportive, but it also helps monitor stress and helps monitor safety. And then from a manager's point of view, again, it's just to re-emphasise the critical role that leaders and managers play in this. A non-judgmental, compassionate and listening manager is one of the most protective things for psychological well-being. So being able to acknowledge to staff that it's okay to not be okay, that experiencing stress doesn't mean that you aren't up to the job, it just means that you're human, that you're having a normal reaction to an abnormal situation. So a good manager is vital in making sense of moral challenges. But it's really important that you do not mandate psychological intervention on people that don't want it. You just have to be open to the fact that they may need it. So people have asked me about these formalised support forums, which you may have heard about: Balance groups, CISMs, Schwartz rounds, debriefing sessions. And really they're all just names for a similar kind of thing. They're just facilitated forums where people are able in a safe environment to reflect on their emotions or experiences of what has happened. And I think there's conflicting evidence about the benefit. You can ask conflicting evidence about the benefit of these at this particular time. Some people would say it's really important to have them as soon after a trauma as possible, and other evidence would suggest that actually it's not really that helpful and it might actually be destructive. And I think certainly at the minute, with the upcoming surge, it seems that it's much more important to have an informal listening ear type role and the opportunity to psychologically ventilate, as opposed to these facilitated forums. They may become more relevant in the future. So hopefully when we get to the end of all of this, it's really important for us, just as I said, to remember that we don't try and not just return to business as usual without giving some consideration to what has gone on. Okay. So despite all of this, for some people, even though they may have done everything that they can to mitigate against becoming unwell, same as you could ensure that you eat healthily, exercise daily, don't smoke, but you could still have a heart attack. You can do all of these things and you can still, unfortunately, suffer from mental illness. And I think the biggest challenge, and I really mean this, the biggest challenge is tackling the stigma that exists towards mental illness and the stigma that exists towards it in the medical world. It's so important that we tackle it, because if we don't tackle it, it's going to be a barrier to people getting help. So, I'm just going to tell you about my own experience briefly. I'm nearly finished, you'll be pleased to know. So I was diagnosed about 18 months ago with breast cancer. Okay? So I experienced something at that stage that I did not want to experience. I didn't want to hear it. I was overwhelmed. I felt totally powerless. And I was full of anticipatory anxiety about what the future held. Very similar to how lots of people are feeling now. And what I needed at that stage was just to be taken care of. I just needed my basic needs to be met. And I needed hope that there was a pathway through the uncertainty. And once the journey began, it wasn't as dreadful as I had anticipated it would be. And I got on with it. And I survived. And then, several months later, something else began to creep in. I felt tired all the time. I couldn't sleep. I woke up at 6 o'clock in the morning, bang, never forget it, with overwhelming feelings of dread. Could not face the day. Did not want to get out of bed. Couldn't eat. Totally overwhelmed by the thoughts that I was really, truly going to die. Now the real risk was past, but my mind was completely consumed with the belief that I was going to die. And despite my knowledge, my training, my experience, I could not see it in myself. I truly believed that I was doomed, and however long or short my life was going to be, that this is how I was going to live my life, the rest of my life, in this horrible state. Now, luckily for me, my husband was my saving grace, and he laughed when I told him this yesterday. But even despite it, even through all of my distorted thinking at the time, I still fundamentally trusted what he said. And he knew that I was depressed, and he told me that I was depressed, and he persuaded me to get help. And that is so, so important. It is so common that when you are really unwell, or not even when you're really unwell, when you're unwell, you cannot see it yourself. It's other people that know you well that can see it. So anyway, he persuaded me to go and get help, and I went. And unfortunately, my difficulties didn't end there. I had difficulties in actually getting help. So other people that didn't know me, even people within the profession, felt that it was really my inability to cope with what I'd gone through, or my diagnosis, or that it was understandable that I was feeling this awful, because after all I'd had a cancer diagnosis. But anyway, eventually, because I had gone on so many times historically to my husband about depression and so on, he got me treatment and I got treatment. And within a very short period of time, I began to get better. And that's the thing for me. If you identify the problem and if you access the treatment quickly, you can get better, and you can get better quite quickly. So just briefly to touch on PTSD, that's the other thing that people are worried about. As I said, 5% variance risk of PTSD, and all PTSD really means is that you can have repetitive intrusive images and so on, nightmares, a sense of numbness, hypervigilance, and emotional distress. Again, it's just to mention it and say that it also is a treatable mental illness. If these signs begin to emerge, there's treatment and help out there, and we can make real inroads into treating of it. And this is what we want to ensure we don't get to the stage of. We want to ensure that at the end of all this, nobody feels this level of hopelessness. Okay? So, just to re-emphasise, please take care of yourself. Physically, exercise, look after your health, eat well, avoid bad things, sleep, and engage with people. So these are just the supports that are available, just quickly to go through. You probably know there's a wealth of supports available online, apps, mindfulness apps, YouTube videos. I mean, there's so much stuff. The BMA has a 24/7 counselling service. Some of the Royal Colleges have helplines, certainly the Royal College of Psychiatry does, and there's a wealth of information on the Royal College of Psychiatry website, mental health problems and so on. And within the Trust, if you go into the MedEdWest part of the site, you'll see when they send us out communications all the time about what's available, but there are lots of online resources there. There's free yoga, for example. There's signposting into other things as well. And only this week there's been a staff psychological support helpline established by our clinical psychology colleagues here in Aldegalvin, and that is, you'll see that on the Trust internet, access to that, or through the MedEdWest, and it's going to be manned 9 to 9, 7 days a week, and that's going to provide a listening ear and signposting into various supports if needs be. And the psychology team are really, really keen for feedback on anything else that people feel may be important for psychological well-being at this time. And I also know that the Doctors Hub has been established as well, so I think that's also extremely useful resource, meeting lots of needs. And then Inspire, that's just what used to be the old care call. That's just a regional thing that's available to all trusts, and the only difference in it is that it's available 24/7, 365 days a year. So, that's me.
Well, I'm lost for words, and people that know me know that I'm very rarely lost for words. That was an absolute tour de force presentation, and I hope all staff that will be recording of this get a chance to see that. So many messages. I'll open to the room. Is there anybody in the room who'd like to ask a question? I can bring the microphone over. I'm guessing stunned silence all round.
Good. I like stunned silence.
Well, just going forward, we're going to need to have a lot of support for other people it would appear, given the challenges that we're facing. Do you see that the psychological resources in the trust will be geared up, will be mobilised to deal with the second wave? And not talking about a second wave of COVID, talking about maybe a wave of psychological issues for the
I suppose
working alongside.
I suppose it's just the same as you face within the acute world in general. It's unprecedented, so there's lots and lots of planning and preparation going in place to try and ensure that that is the case. I mean, for example, that helpline, I mean, there are 40 different healthcare professionals contributing to that helpline now on an ongoing basis, with the anticipation of that being ongoing for as long as needs be. So I would certainly understand that our clinical psychology colleagues are very committed to it.
Hopefully the resources will still be there when all this is over. I want to say thank you very much indeed, Helen Connolly, for speaking today, and we'll close the session there. Thank you.
Thank you.